The wind screamed through the empty village, bearing with it whispers that were not of the living. The moon, a ghostly and wan specter, cast its weak light upon the empty houses, their windows gaping like the empty eyes of the dead. The old trees that ringed the village creaked threateningly, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky as if to keep something at bay. Gulzib shivered as he walked onto the broken cobblestone path into the very center of the village. The night was abnormally quiet, with only the rustling of leaves and the far-off scurrying sound of something just out of sight. He clenched his hand tighter around the lantern he held, its flickering light casting grotesque shadows against the walls of the old buildings, covered in moss. He had been here once before, as a boy, when his grandmother had cautioned him never to come back. "This village is cursed," she had spoken in a voice barely above a whisper, her face shaking with an emotion he did not grasp then. "The souls here are hollowed, lost between worlds." And now, all those years later, he was returned. And he was not alone. Behind him, Bilal, Arif, Fadil, Jamil, Tariq, and Ulaat trailed quietly, their own faces white and strained. They had all heard the tales, whispers of a village engulfed in shadow, where human beings had simply disappeared. And still, they had come, because they were curious and because they could not resist a challenge. "What in the world is that smell?" Jamil grumbled, holding his nose. The air reeked of damp soil, rotting, and something else, something putrid like rotten meat. "Dead animals, probably," Bilal ventured, though his tone was unconvincing. Asma, Fariha, Hania, and Lubna lagged behind, their steps uncertain. "I don't like it," Fariha whispered. "We shouldn't be here." "It's just an abandoned village," Tariq said, forcing a chuckle. "We'll take some pictures, maybe explore a few houses, and then leave. No big deal." But even he didn't sound convinced. A sudden gust of wind blew through the village, and the old wooden signs creaked ominously. The temperature dropped, and a sense of suffocating dread settled over them. Then they heard it, a whisper, low, guttural, and inhuman. The group froze. "Did you hear that?" Lubna's voice was a mere breath. They all shook their heads. The whisper repeated itself, curling around them like the voice of someone long dead. It was impossible to discern from which direction it came, perhaps from the abandoned homes or the twisted trees, or maybe the ground. Gulzib's heart raced against his ribcage. "Let's move on," he muttered, though every cell in his body was urging him to flee. They moved forward, walking by a line of crumbling houses. Some had doors swinging off their hinges, some had fallen completely in. The remains of furniture, shattered glass, and discarded possessions covered the ground, standing still as if their owners had departed in haste. "What's going on here?" Asma whispered, her gaze sweeping the creepy environment. "No one is certain," Arif answered. "Some claim a plague killed the village. Others claim the villagers just vanished." "I heard they were abducted," Fadil whispered, "by something that dwells in darkness." A thick silence ensued. The whispering increased. Then, bang! Something crashed against the wooden door of a house to their right. Hania cried out, and the group recoiled, their breathing harsh gasps. The door shook furiously, like something within was trying to break free. "Run!" Tariq yelled. But they hadn't moved before the door opened. The lantern's dancing light only barely penetrated the interior, but what it showed chilled their blood. A figure stood deep within the shadows of the house. Its body was abnormally thin, its arms stretched, its face empty. The beast had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Only a smooth, featureless expanse where a face ought to have been. Then it moved, a contorted, jerking gait, as if its bones were shattering with each step. The group took off. Gulzib ran as fast as he had ever run in his life, the thudding of heavy footsteps echoing behind him. The whispers were now screams, echoing through the night with an unearthly howl. They did not cease until they arrived at the square of the village, panting for air. But the terror was only just beginning. The earth shook beneath them, and a low, rumbling voice boomed in the darkness. "You should not have come." The wind grew cold, and the shadows closing in on them started to stir. Then, each lantern went out in turn. They were engulfed in darkness, and the whispering never ceased. The darkness was choking. It enveloped them like a living thing, crushing against their skin, filling their lungs, and speaking in voices not for the living. The village square, once seen under the faint moonlight, had vanished into a pit of shadows. Gulzaib fought for air, his heart pounding in his ears. The voices, whispers and twisted murmurs, filtered into his mind, burrowing into the farthest recesses of his consciousness. "You shouldn't have come." The words repeated themselves, echoing from all sides. Then, a scream. "Asthma!" someone shouted. Gulzaib turned around, his arms outstretched in the dark. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't determine where his friends were. "Asthma, where are you?" More screams, a wild thrashing of feet, the sound of someone crying. Then, the lanterns came back on, gave light to the creatures that wrestled and screamed. The faint light showed the frightened faces of his friends: Arif, Bilal, Fadil, Jamil, Tariq, Ulat, Fariha, Hania, Lubna. They were all present, but Asma was not. "Asma!" Fariha's voice was panicked, her eyes scanning the deserted village square. "Where is she?" Jamil's face was white. "She was standing right beside me a moment ago, and then the lights went out." "She was taken," Lubna whispered, her voice shaking. "No," Tariq snapped. "She must have just lost her way. Maybe she ran when we heard..." "The voice," Ulat cut in. "You heard it too, didn't you?" No one replied. They all had. Gulzaib pushed himself to reason. "We have to find her. We can't just leave her here." "Find her?" Bilal emitted a dry laugh. "You'd have us dig through this whole area when we just witnessed..." He paused, wrapping his head in frustration. "We have to leave." "And leave Asma behind?" Fariha's voice cracked. "We don't even know if she's still..." She had trouble getting out the last word, couldn't get it past the lump. The whispering was back, spinning around them, closer. Something was lurking around them. "Okay, listen," Gulzaib instructed, attempting to maintain a calm voice. "We split up, but we don't go separately. Couples. Search quickly. Meet up here in 10 minutes. Nobody approved of the plan, but they had no alternative. Gulzaib and Arif approached the old houses. Their lanterns created long, dancing shadows on the broken walls. The farther they went, the colder it got. "Something is not right about this place," Arif grumbled. Gulzaib said nothing. His fingers followed the rotten wooden frame of a door. It was ajar. "Asma?" he called. His voice hardly made it past the doorway. No reply. He opened the door further, and it groaned in agony. The air within was heavy with dust and something worse, the unmistakable smell of rot. The floor was littered with shattered glass and putrid furniture, but the worst was the walls. They were smeared with scratches, deep, frantic claw marks, as if someone had attempted to claw their way out. A shiver ran down his spine. "Let's get out of here," Arif said. Gulzaib spun around toward the door and stopped. A figure loomed just beyond the doorway. Not Asma. It was the same faceless thing from earlier. It cocked its head in that unnatural, broken fashion. Its body twitched as if barely held together. Then it charged. Gulzaib pushed Arif back, slamming the door shut. The wood rattled crazily as something crashed against it from the other side. "Run!" Gulzaib took Arif's arm, jerking him down the street, while Fadil and Tariq walked towards the edge of the village in the direction of the dead trees that demarcated the border between the tainted land and the dark forest that lay beyond. "Asma!" Tariq shouted. No reply. "Do you notice that?" Fadil asked, his voice a sudden whisper. Tariq looked at him. Notice what? The ground. It's... Fadil dropped to his knees, laying his palm on the earth. It was humming, like something beneath was waking. A low groaning filled the darkness of the night. Then, a hand shot out of the ground. Fadil screamed, flailing backward as more hands pushed up into the ground. Rotten skeletal fingers grabbed at the air, trying to catch them. Tariq grabbed him. "Run!" But the earth they stood on gave way beneath them. They plummeted downward. Gulzaib, Arif, and the rest heard the cries. "That was Tariq and Fadil," Jamil screamed. They stumbled towards the sound, sliding to a stop as they took in the huge pit in the ground. "Tariq! Fadil!" Silence. The pit was deep, descending into a tunnel complex under the village. It was lined with stone that was at least 1,000 years old, the walls sculpted with mystical symbols. A crypt. Gulzaib's stomach had fallen. They fell down there. There was a small evil chuckle from down below, and then Fadil's voice, distorted and unnatural. "Come down, it's beautiful here." Against their better judgment, they descended. The walls of the tunnel were wet, the air heavy with the smell of soil and death. Bizarre, throbbing roots writhed along the walls, as if alive. "Where are they?" Hania breathed. "They're near," Ulat replied. "I can hear them." A pale light flickered at the end of the tunnel. They tracked it. What they saw chilled their blood. Fadil and Tariq stood in the middle of a huge underground chamber. Their backs were to him, their heads at unnatural angles. Before them was an altar, and on it, Asma. She lay unconscious, her body stretched out across the stone slab. Glowing beneath her were strange symbols, pulsating with a dark energy. "We have to get her out of there," Gulzaib said. He stepped forward. Fadil and Tariq turned. Their eyes were missing, hollow. They smiled, and the shadows started to stir. The subterranean cavern vibrated with a sick, unnatural power. The air reeked of rot and wet soil. The walls seemed to breathe, to slide in and out with every motion. Shadows caped unnaturally across the stone-sculpted walls, cast by light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. Gulzaib's chest constricted as he breathed in the ghastly sight before him. Asma was lying motionless on the ancient altar, her complexion ashen under the faint light of the throbbing symbols. Fadil and Tariq were standing over her, their eyes mere empty spaces, grotesque grins painted across their faces. The rest were standing still behind Gulzaib, their breathing shallow, their minds grappling to understand the horror before them. "Tariq, Fadil." Jamil's voice trembled. "What's wrong with you?" "They're not them anymore." Lubna spoke softly, grasping Fariha's arm. The two stepped forward, a jerky synchronization of steps, stiff, yet unnatural as marionettes jerked about by invisible fingers. "Approach," the voice of Tariq sounded out, and yet it wasn't his. It was inflected, ringing, clogged, some forgotten voice that came through his throat. "She is ready." A fierce blast of wind shrieked through the room, sweeping dust and withered leaves about them. "Ready for what?" Gulzaib barked, his hands curled into fists. Fadil emitted a cackle, a dry echoing sound that caused shivers to run down their backs. "The offering has started." With those words, the glyphs under Asma began to burn brighter, their light increasing into a queasy red color. Asma flinched. Then she drew a sharp breath, her eyes snapping open. But they were no longer her eyes. They were black. Utterly, eternally black. "Asma!" Faria attempted to hurry towards her, but Ulat caught her, restraining her. "No, we must stop this." Asma gradually sat up, her movements stiff and unnatural. She turned her head towards them, her face empty. Then she spoke. "You should not be here." Her voice was layered, like Tariq's, an unnatural mixture of her own and something much more ancient. "The forgotten need to awaken," she went on. "The cycle cannot be halted." There was a loud rumbling that shook the earth under their feet. Cracks appeared along the stone floor, pulsating with the same red energy. Something below the chamber was stirring. "We have to get out of here," Arif whispered, backing away. "Now!" Gulzaib knew he was correct. Whatever was going on with Asma, Tariq, and Fadil, they were not strong enough to resist it. Not yet. "Go!" he commanded. The group spun around and fled, their footsteps ringing down the winding tunnels as the walls shook around them. But the instant they arrived at the crypt entrance, the door slammed shut. They were trapped. The air inside the chamber became thick, some unseen pressure pinning their chests. The whispers came back, louder now, whispering an unknown language no one could recognize. Jamil beat on the stone door. "No, no, no, open up!" "It won't open," Lubna managed to gasp, her eyes wide with terror. Gulzaib spun back to Asma. She was upright now, her feet just off the floor. The blackness in her eyes churned like a living thing, strands of shadow spilling from her fingers. "Why struggle?" she said. "It has already started." Then she raised her hand. The air grew frosty cold. A power slammed into Gulzaib and the others like a wave, throwing them against the walls. Pain lanced through Gulzaib's ribs as he struck the cold stone, struggling to breathe. He forced himself upright, his heart pounding. "Asma, listen to me," he bellowed. "Whatever this thing is, it's controlling you. You must fight it." Her face remained impassive. "There is nothing to fight. I am one with it now." A dark mist wrapped around her, and then... The room was no longer empty. Figures stepped out of the shadows. Tall, skeletal beings with empty eyes and contorted limbs. They jerked forward in unnatural movements, their faces twisted into perpetual pain. Their whispers merged into one mournful chorus. "The forgotten," Arif breathed. "They're real." The beings moved closer, encircling them. "What do we do?" Hania cried. Gulzaib gritted his teeth. They couldn't die here. "Stay together," he said. "We fight if we have to." One of the beasts lunged. Gulzaib just avoided it as a clawed hand swept across his face, its fingers abnormally long and razor-sharp. He picked up a shattered fragment of stone on the ground and swung. The beast screamed as the stone hit its skull, but it did not drop. Instead, it contorted its head at an impossible angle and emitted a low, guttural laugh. Gulzaib stumbled backward. They couldn't be killed. The monsters swarmed. Shrieks echoed through the room as the crew struggled to fight back. But it was futile. The shadows moved along with them, sealing off all avenues of escape. Then, out of nowhere, a bell tolled. A deep, booming sound that rattled the very foundations of the crypt. The monsters locked in place. The whispers stopped. And for the first time, Asma's face faltered. A fleeting moment of uncertainty. Then the stone door groaned open. "Run!" Gulzaib yelled. They didn't need to be told twice. They crawled in one by one, the unseen weight of eyes searing their backs. When the last one of them crossed the door slammed shut. They fell against the forest floor outside the crypt, panting. The village stood behind them, air thick with the same unnatural silence. Asma, Fadil, and Tariq were never seen again. The others sat in stunned silence, their minds reeling from what they had just witnessed. They weren't themselves anymore, Fariha breathed. "They're not dead," Gulzaib insisted. "We can still save them." Arif turned to him. "How?" "You saw what we were fighting. That thing inside Asma. It's old. It's powerful. We don't even know what it is." "We have to find out," Jamil said, "before it's too late." A rustling sound had attracted their notice. They turned and found an old woman at the tree line. Her face was etched with deep lines, her eyes hollow but bright. She wore folds of frayed cloth, her bony hands holding a wooden staff. "You have roused something which should have been left below ground," she croaked. Gulzaib's gut turned. "You recognize what this is, don't you?" The woman inclined her head, slow. "I have been waiting centuries. You will listen closely. To survive, and to save your friends, you have to complete that which was initiated long ago." A gust of wind tore between the trees, full of whispers in the distance. The Forgotten had awakened, and they came. The darkness of the night hung heavy with a strange silence. The old village waited, frozen still, waiting for something from beyond the depths of the darkness to push into the world of light. The great trees that closed in on them whispered softly, their branches speaking secrets humans were not meant to listen to. The elderly woman, her stooped figure barely perceptible beneath the folds of frayed cloth, glared at them with eyes that bore the weight of centuries. The moonlight shone upon her weathered face, tracing deep lines of suffering and knowledge etched into her skin. Lines not merely of age, but of experience. "You have to listen carefully," she croaked, her voice little more than a whisper. "The cycle has started again. If you want to end it, there is no going back." Gulzaib's fists were clenched, his head still spinning from the atrocities they had just narrowly escaped. What is happening to this village, to Asma, Tariq, and Fadil? The woman's eyes grew dark. They are lost, temporarily, but not beyond redemption. The Forgotten hold them, and if you do not move swiftly, they will be among the hallowed souls forevermore. A chill ran down their spine. Jamil gulped. What are the hallowed souls? The woman let out a deep breath and beckoned them to follow. "Come with me. This is not a tale to be spoken in the streets. The night has ears." They led her along a serpentine, narrow path that cut deeper into the heart of the village. The homes they walked past were vacant, their windows broken, doors open as if welcoming occupants that would never be coming back. It was as if time itself had been left in suspension here, creating only ghosts and shadows. And lastly, they arrived at a tiny hut, the sole habitation that showed signs of inhabitation. The woman opened the wooden door with a push of her hand and invited them to come in. Within, there was a smell of herbs and smoldering incense filling the air. There were bookshelves upon the walls, stacked with ancient volumes, scrolls, and peculiar items. There was a single flickering candle near the center of the room that cast weird shadows dancing across the walls. "Sit," she commanded. The group sat in silence for a moment before finally coming to rest on the floor. The woman sank into a groaning wooden chair and breathed deeply. "This village was not always cursed," she started, her voice far away, as if remembering things long forgotten. "It was once a thriving village, inhabited by families who lived in harmony with the earth. But centuries ago, something awful occurred." She grasped a small wooden box on the table and opened it slowly. Inside was an ancient parchment, frayed at the edges and yellowed with age. She unrolled it out before them, showing faded symbols and scribbled writing in a language that none of them could understand. "This is the testament of the hallowed souls," she told them. "It tells of a great betrayal and the birth of the Forgotten." Lubna hunched forward, her gaze raking over the cryptic symbols. "What does it mean?" The woman paused before going on. "A long, long time ago, some villagers discovered a secret under this earth. A burial ground, one that was never to be disturbed. Inside it, they discovered the remains of an ancient thing, something sealed away for a purpose." She returned their stares, her face serious. But their greed conquered their fear. They dug up what was meant to be kept buried, thinking it would make them powerful and prosperous. They did not know that they had unleashed a curse upon themselves. There was a heavy silence in the room. "The forgotten dead rose that evening," she went on, speaking in a soft whisper. "And the villagers started to vanish one by one. Some were pulled into darkness, their spirits drained, their bodies left forlorn vessels. Others were transformed into something worse than that." Fariha gasped. "Asma, Tariq, and Fadil." The woman nodded, Yes, they have been taken, but there is still hope to redeem them, if you are prepared to confront the truth of this world. Gulzaib shifted forward, his heart racing. Tell us what we have to do. The woman watched him for a hard moment before, at last, nodding. There's a ritual, an old one. They used it ages past to imprison the forgotten away, but they didn't finish. She nodded to the parchment. The details are here, but take this warning. These spirits won't let themselves be driven out so easily. Arif looked at the parchment and scowled. How do we even know this is going to work? What if it's too late? The woman's face grew grim. If you do nothing, your friends will be lost forever, and soon the curse will spread farther than this village. Jamil took a deep breath shakily. So, what do we need? The woman stood up from her chair and walked towards one of the shelves. She took an old, rusty dagger and a small vial of dark liquid. You will have to go back to the crypt, she said. There. You need to find the Heartstone, the heart of the Forgotten's power. This dagger is the only weapon that can cut its link with the souls it has consumed. She offered the dagger to Gulzaib. But take care. The spirits won't make things easy for you. Fariha shivered. And the vial? The woman's lips pressed into a narrow line. This is blood from the previous sacrifice. It has to be spilled upon the Heartstone prior to uttering the last incantation. Only that will lift the curse. The group looked uneasily at one another. This is crazy, Ulat grumbled. We just barely escaped that place alive the first time, and now we have to return? Gulzaib clutched the dagger more tightly. We don't have a choice. The woman nodded in approval. Good. You depart at dawn. The last few hours before the descent sleep was out of the question. Both of them were awake, their minds haunted by images of what they would find in the crypt. The shadows' whispers, the grotesque shapes of their deceased friends, the sense of being observed. Gulzaib sat beside the window, observing the village in the faint moonlight. Something about this village did not feel right. Like the land itself was living, breathing, and waiting for them to strike. At dawn, they packed what they had, the dagger, the vial, and what little courage remained. The old woman stood watching them leave. Remember, she cautioned, you may not go back once you're inside. If you fail, you will be like them. No one said a word as they emerged into the chill of the morning air. The way to the crypt seemed longer this time, the burden of their mission bearing down on them with every step. The doorway stretched before them, its darkness yawned like an open mouth, hungry to devour them whole. Gulzaib looked at the others. This is it. Jamil breathed deeply. Whatever we find in there, we do not leave one another behind. Each of them entered the abyss one by one, and the shadows embraced them once more. The crypt stood before them, its wide-open mouth releasing a wet, sickly breath heavy with decay and lost grief. The gray above was heavy, sullen, as if heaven itself grieved for those brave enough to go in. One look between the group said it all. Fear, desperation, resolve. Gulzaib gripped the rusted dagger presented to him by the old woman more tightly. In his other hand, the vial of black liquid chilled his skin. The instant we enter, Arif whispered, his voice little more than a whisper above the wind. There's no turning back. We know, Fariha murmured, her eyes darting toward the entrance where shadows seemed to slither and shift. With a steadying breath, Gulzaib stepped forward. The others followed, their footsteps hesitant, their hearts pounding in their chests. The darkness swallowed them whole. The crypt was worse than they had remembered. The air clung thickly with a cloying staleness, a blend of old blood and something even more foul. The walls, hewn from ancient stone, were slick with damp, and every few steps they caught sight of bones, human bones, scattered about in the corners, half hidden in dust. We have to hurry, Jamil pressed, his voice taut with tension. "The spirits know we're here." As if answer, a breath slid through the air. A voice that was not theirs, far away but near, a whisper against the back of their necks. "Turn. Back." Fariha made a small gasp, tightening her arms around herself. "They're staring at us." "We move forward," Gulzaib instructed bluntly, leading them further in. The tunnels turned and curved, each corridor constricting, making them have to squirm through wet passageways where unseen fingers appeared to touch their skin. Then, in front, the tunnel widened into a huge chamber. And there, in the middle, were Tariq, Asma, and Fadil. Or what was left of them. Their bodies were hardly human. Their flesh had taken on an unnatural gray color, their eyes empty pits of blackness. Their limbs jerked unnaturally, as if controlled by some hidden power. Their mouths curled into grotesque smiles that were not their own. "You returned." Tariq's voice hissed through the air, but it wasn't his. It was multi-layered, warped. "Why?" Asma asked, cocking her head at an awkward angle. "Do you think you can rescue us?" Fadil's hand jerked. "You can't. It's too late." Gulzaib's fingers clenched around the dagger. "We're taking you back." A laugh burst out of all three, cold, hollow, inhuman. "Back," Fadil sang. "There is no back. There is only this." And they began to move. Tariq attacked first. His movements were too rapid, too artificial. Gulzaib had no chance to dodge before Asma clutched him from behind, her fingers encircling his arms. Her touch was ice cold, a numbing feel to his skin. "Hold her back!" Arif yelled, picking up a rusty chain lying on the floor and curling it around Asma's arm. She was pulled back. Jamil flailed a torch at Tariq, the fire making him hiss and pull back. "They respond to fire. Then let's utilize it." Ulat picked up another torch from the wall and hurled it at Fadil, pushing him away. But they weren't just fighting their friends. They were fighting the force that controlled them, and it was powerful. Tariq attacked Lubna, who just managed to duck out of the way in time. "They're trying to catch us," she screamed. Gulzaib made a split-second decision. "We have to reach the Heartstone. That's the only way to shatter this." "The chamber must be up ahead," Jamil yelled. "Move!" With every ounce of strength, they pushed forward, dodging and fighting off the cursed figures of their former friends. Shadows clawed at them from every corner, whispers growing into agonized screams. Then they reached it. The last chamber was enormous, its walls adorned with symbols of a lost language. And in the middle, on a raised stone altar, beat the Heartstone, a jagged, blackened crystal, seeping a thick, dark fog. It was alive, pulsating with evil energy. The whispers grew deafening. "Kill them. Join us. It is hopeless." Gulzaib stumbled beneath the pressure of the voices beating against his head. The others grasped their heads, resisting the force that sought to shatter them. "Do it!" Fariha shrieked. "Shatter it now!" And when Gulzaib lifted the dagger, a force out of the darkness struck. There stepped out before him a colossal figure whose shape changed like smoke, whose eyes blazed with an otherworldly light. It was they, the Forgotten. "You cannot turn back from this," it breathed, its voice a coming together of thousands of voices. "This village is ours." The shadow burst forth, its shape encircling Gulzaib, choking him with icy cold. His fingers froze, the dagger falling from his hand. "No!" Lubna shouted, snatching the dagger and flinging it at him. Gulzaib picked it up, just in time. With the strength left in him, he drove the blade into the Heartstone. The room burst with a searing light. The earth shook. The walls shattered. The Forgotten screamed a cry so sharp it seemed their heads would shatter in two. The Heartstone split, dark liquid flowing from its center. Tariq, Asma, and Fadil screamed unnatural cries before crashing to the ground, their bodies jerking in spasm as whatever had seized them was torn free. The shadows retreated, screaming as the chamber collapsed. "Run!" Jamil shouted. They sprinted, leaping over crashing rubble, fighting against the collapsing crypt. The cries of the forgotten grew distant as they stumbled through the entrance into the chill night air. The instant the last of them were out, the crypt collapsed in its entirety, entombing the terrors within. The village was quiet. The air was changed, lighter, as if a burden had been removed. Tariq, Asma, and Fadil woke, their eyes blinking open in confusion. "It's over," Fariha whispered. Gulzaib glanced at the wreckage of the crypt. For now. The old woman was standing at the edge of the village, waiting for them. She nodded gravely. "You have done what no one else could. The village is free. But at what price?" Ulat grumbled, gazing at their weary, battered company. The woman's face grew shadowed. "The forgotten are weakened, but evil never dies. It merely sleeps." An oppressive silence descended over them. When dawn crept over the accursed village, they knew one thing for certain. Some nightmares never end. The village remained in a creepy quiet, as if it was holding its breath after the destruction of the crypt. The accursed ruins were covered up, the heartstone broken, and their dead friends had been released from the evil clutches of the forgotten. But victory did not bring relief. Instead, an uneasy burden pervaded the atmosphere. The sun in the morning did little to dispel the encroaching shadows that clung to buildings and trees. The villagers, previously reluctant to venture out of their homes, now emerged hesitantly, eyes cast about the countryside with suspicion. Something was amiss. Gulzaib stood at the village center, gazing at the pile of rubble where the crypt used to be. His fingers ran over the scratches on his arm, scratches from his fight with the forgotten. "We did it, didn't we?" Fariha's voice was quiet, but uncertain. He turned to her. "It should be over." "Then why does it feel like we failed?" Arif growled, arms crossed and leaning on a shattered pillar. They hardly had time to react before an old woman arrived. Her age-lined face was stern, the walking stick rhythmically thudding against cobblestone pavement. "You shattered the heartstone," she muttered, her expression weighted with whatever it was. "But you did not ruin the curse." The words cut through them like ice. "What are you trying to say?" Jamil gritted, the frustration evident in his voice. "That was the source, wasn't it?" The old woman sighed. The heartstone was a container, not a source. She gazed towards the forest past the village. The actual evil was never held in the crypt. It merely used the heartstone as a channel. Now it is loose. A chill burst of wind roared through the village. The shadows appeared to move abnormally, stretching out in the increasing light. Lubna wrapped her arms. "You're telling me it's still out there?" "Not here," the old woman whispered, "but it has awakened." The village did not sleep that night. The wind screamed down the narrow streets, bearing whispers without a source. The villagers huddled in doorways, candles burning in windows, too frightened to venture outside. And then, the first scream broke the silence. Gulzaib and the others ran towards the noise, brandishing torches. It was from the edge of the village, close to the ruins of a deserted house. A man was lying on the ground, his eyes open in fright. His lips were moving, uttering words they could not hear. Lubna crouched down beside him. "He's alive!" The man's body jerked spasmodically, his hands grasped at the ground. Then, a low, raspy whisper escaped his lips, one that was not his own. "You cannot escape." A jolt propelled everyone backward as the man emitted an unnatural scream. His body contorted in pain, and then he froze. Silence. Faria buried her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with terror. "What was that?" Jamil inched forward slowly. "He's dead." but Gulzaib understood better. The instant the Heartstone had broken, the Forgotten had been set free from their captivity. They weren't confined to the crypt anymore. They were everywhere. Throughout the long night, there were more screams. Villagers fell one by one, some thrashing, others speaking in voices that were not their own. The villagers gathered in the old woman's house, the sole location that remained unaffected by the evil. "They're being possessed," Ulat whispered, his knuckles white on the table edge. "But we killed the source," Jamil insisted. "How is this possible?" "The source was never actually bound to the Heartstone," the old woman replied. "It was merely a piece of the Forgotten's power. Now that it is free, it is looking for new hosts. And if it kills enough of them," Gulzaib said darkly, "it will become even more powerful." The room grew thick with silence. "So how do we get rid of it?" Arif finally asked. The old woman closed her eyes, her forehead furrowed in concentration. "There is only one way." She addressed herself to Gulzaib. "You have to go to the first tomb." "The what?" Fariha blinked in perplexity. The elderly woman gestured to the hills east. "Well before this village was constructed, there existed another village, a place forgotten by the passage of time. There the first of the Forgotten was buried, tied in an ancient rite. The tomb is the key to breaking this nightmare." "How do you know all of this?" Arif squinted. The old woman faltered. And then, with a shuddering breath, she yanked back her sleeve. A weathered mark, the same eerie symbols they'd found on their crypt raid. "I was born into the Order of the Keepers," she confessed. "For centuries we protected this land, seeing that the seal was intact. But we succeeded." Gulzaib's jaw gritted. "So we set it right." As dawn was breaking, the group marched towards the eastern hills. The terrain outside the village was desolate, the trees dead and twisted. The air chilled with every step, and the sky clouded unnaturally in spite of the rising sun. "We shouldn't be here," Lubna breathed. But they had no option. They walked for hours and came upon the remains of an ancient village. Dilapidated stone buildings protruded from the ground like shattered teeth. The air was heavy with the smell of rot. And in the middle of it stood the tomb. A gargantuan stone door, adorned with the same old symbols as the Heartstone, barred their path. "This is it," the old woman said, "the resting place of the first soul to be taken by the Forgotten." Gulzaib moved forward, laying his hand on the door. A low hum ran through the stone. The markings glowed with a soft light. Then, a voice, low and ancient, rang from inside. "Who comes seeking the grave of the Hallowed One?" The earth shook, the stone door creaked, and then it swung open. The room beyond was enormous and stifling. Stairs descended far below the ground, where there were rows of dried-out corpses along the walls. A giant sarcophagus, wrapped in iron chains, was at the far end of the room. Gulzaib walked forward, his heart pounding. "This is it." The old woman nodded. "We have to do the ritual." She passed a small dagger with odd etchings on the blade to Gulzaib. "The only way to hold the Forgotten is to seal it in a new vessel." "A vessel?" Fariha's voice trembled with fear. "You mean one of us?" The old woman's silence was answer enough. A shadow shifted. The sarcophagus trembled, and then it opened. A wave of darkness burst forth from within, swirling like a tempest. The air grew ice cold, and then it spoke. "You can't halt what's already been set in motion." A form crawled from the coffin, a man, or what remained of one. His skin drawn taut over bone, his eyes black holes, his mouth contorted into a horrific grin. The Hallowed One stirred. The room dissolved into pandemonium. The shadows attacked, tendrils of darkness coiling around them. The walls shuddered, dust falling from above. Gulzaib brandished the dagger. "We must complete this." The Hallowed One charged at him, its speed that of something unnatural. Jamil picked up a torch and swung, fire caressing the creature's shape. It emitted an unnatural shriek, retreating. "Keep it occupied," Arif bellowed. Fariha, Ulat, and Jamil struggled to keep back the advancing darkness as Gulzaib made a dash for the sarcophagus. The crone started chanting, her voice piercing the wailing wind. The air rippled. The hollowed one screamed, its shape wavering. Gulzaib clenched his teeth. He lifted the dagger and plunged it deep within the creature's chest. Blinding light flooded the chamber. The hollowed one gave one last, ear-shattering scream before its body dispersed into dust. The darkness withdrew, curling away to nothing. Then silence. The forgotten were departed, for the time being. The cavern shook with the final ringing of the hollowed one's dying scream. The air hung thick with the essence of the evil that had stuck to reality for centuries. Gulzaib ripped the blade free from the chest of the creature, gasping for breath. The magnitude of what they'd done weighed them all down. It felt almost like victory in that moment. Then the ground moaned. A low, guttural thrum vibrated through the walls of the tomb, intensifying with every second. Rocks shattered, dust fell from the ceiling, and an unseen power caused the air to vibrate with an agonizing pressure. Ulat staggered backward, clutching his head. "Something's wrong. The darkness, it's not vanished." Gulzaib wheeled on the old woman, her face pale. "What's happening?" She opened her mouth, but before she could talk, the sarcophagus started shaking wildly. A nauseating crack tore through the air as its stone cover broke entirely apart. A voice, deeper and older than before, spoke from the emptiness within. "You fools, you have only awakened me." From the shattered sarcophagus, something started to emerge. It was no longer human. A churning mass of darkness, twisting and contorting, as if innumerable souls were imprisoned inside. A wide maw opened in its center, and inside it, faces. Distorted, tormented faces of the lost, their mouths open in perpetual screams. Fariha recoiled, holding onto Jamil's arm. "No. That thing. It's all of them." The voice of the old woman trembled. "It is the collection of all souls eaten by the curse. The hollowed one was only its husk. This is the horror." The blackness radiated out like water and ink, crawling towards them with an otherworldly appetite. "You broke the heartstone, but the souls were still here. And now I will claim you all." There was a chilling, bone-deep cold that swept through the chamber. The torches guttered and went out, leaving them in almost total darkness. And then the first scream. Lubna was the first to go. A lash of shadow sprang out, encircled her ankle before she had time to move. She screamed, scrabbling at the ground as it pulled her towards the abyss. "Help me!" she cried. Gulzaib made a grab for her arm. "Hold on!" But the darkness was too quick. A second tendril coiled around her neck, dragging her back with unnatural force. Her eyes bulged in horror as she was dragged into the twisting emptiness. And then, she was gone. No body, no sound, no trace, just gone. Faria's sob was almost a scream. "We have to get out of here!" But the darkness did not relent. Another tendril burst out, landing on Tariq in the chest. He gasped, his body shaking furiously as the blackness entered his flesh. His eyes rolled back, and his lips curled into an unnatural smile. His voice, not his own anymore, whispered, "You can't escape. You are mine already." And then his body fell into a heap of dust. Gulzaib clutched the old woman by the shoulders. "You told us the first tomb would stop this. Tell us how." Her eyes were far away, as if the burden of all those years of failure had finally broken her. "The seal must be put back." Arif clenched his teeth. "How?" She shut her eyes. "A sacrifice. A willing soul must become the new vessel to bind the darkness." Silence. Fariha shook. "No, we can't." Before anyone could answer, the darkness attacked again. A sweeping wave of black consumed Jamil. his body dissolving before he could even scream. Gulzaib faced the sarcophagus again. Then we don't have a choice. The ground beneath them cracked open. A bottomless void stretched into nothingness, pulling at them with an unnatural force. The tomb was collapsing. Gulzaib turned to Arif and Fariha. "Go! Get out of here!" Arif shook his head. "We're not leaving you!" "You have to!" Gulzaib shouted. "If this thing isn't sealed, it'll consume the entire village." Fariha froze, eyes wide with terror. But before she could object, a tendril flashed towards her. Arif pushed her out of the way, absorbing the impact himself. "No!" Fariha shrieked as Arif's body contorted in pain. His skin cracked open like porcelain, black veins webbing his face. He grinned at Gulzaib with a faint smile. "Make it count." Then he was gone. Gulzaib gripped his fists, turning once more to the sarcophagus. The shadows waited, expectant. Taking a deep breath, he entered. The instant his feet landed in the interior of the coffin, darkness attacked. It engulfed him, its claws digging into his skin, scorching him from within. "You really believe you can hold me?" The voices taunted. But Gulzaib clenched his jaws. He lifted the dagger, the final fragment of the old magic, and plunged it into his own chest. A flash of light poured out of the wound. The cavern shook with a violent motion. The darkness screamed, twisting in pain. The faces inside it contorted, their faces shifting from anger to terror. The old woman started chanting, her voice increasing in an ancient tongue. The symbols on the walls of the tomb flared to life, burning into the stone. The darkness convulsed. And then, with a last, deafening scream, it collapsed inward, drawn into the sarcophagus. The lid slammed shut, closing it once again. The cavern shook, and then, silence. Fariha gasped, her body weak with fatigue, as she stumbled out of doors. The sky was clear. The village, which had been enveloped in an unnatural gloom, now bathed in the pale radiance of morning. The old woman stood next to her, her eyes filled with grief. "It is done." Fariha spun, her heart pounding. "Where is Gulzaib?" The old woman did not reply. Tears filled Fariha's eyes as she glanced back at the tomb. The entrance had closed, the stone unblemished by time. A resting place, a jail for the darkness, and an offering. She knelt, calling out his name, but only the wind replied. Days went by. The village gradually came back to life, but the wounds of the atrocities lingered. The villagers grieved their dead, but they also lived, something they hadn't done in decades. But deep inside the closed tomb, in the crushing darkness, something moved. A whisper, a breath, a heartbeat. The hollowed souls had not been eradicated, only waiting for the next to arrive. If you enjoyed Hollowed Souls, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Phantom Fables for more chilling stories. Your nightmares have only just begun.